Chapter 47. We traversed some miles of desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds a silent, mournful expanse, wherein we saw only 3 persons Arabs, with nothing on but a long coarse shirt like the tow linen shirts, which used to form the only summer garment of little Negro boys on southern plantations. Shepherds they were, and they charmed their flocks with the traditional shepherd's pipa reed instrument that made music as exquisitely infernal as these same Arabs create when they sing. In their pipes lingered no echo of the wonderful music the shepherd forefathers heard in the plains of Bethlehem, what time the angels sang, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." Part of the ground we came over was not ground at all, but rock-scream-colored rocks, worn smooth as if by water, with seldom an edge or a corner on them, but scooped out, honeycombed, bored out with eye-holes, and thus wrought into all manner of quaint shapes, among which the uncouth imitation of skulls was frequent. Over this part of the route were occasional remains of an old Roman road like the Appian Way, whose paving stones still clung to their places with Roman tenacity. Gray lizards, those heirs of ruin, of sepulchres and desolation, glided in and out among the rocks or lay still and sunned themselves. Where prosperity has reigned and fallen, where glory has flamed and gone out, where beauty has dwelt and passed away, where gladness was and sorrow is, where the pomp of life has been and silence and death brood in its high places, there this reptile makes his home and mocks at human vanity. His coat is the color of ashes, and ashes are the symbol of hopes that have perished, of aspirations that came to naught, of loves that are buried. If he could speak, he would say, "Build temples, I will lord it in their ruins. Build palaces, I will inhabit them, erect empires, I will inherit them, bury your beautiful. I will watch the worms at their work, and you, who stand here and moralize over me, I will crawl over your corpse at the last." A few ants were in this desert place, but merely to spend the summer. They brought their provisions from Ain Mellah 11 miles. Jack is not very well today, it is easy to see, but boy as he is too much of a man to speak of it. He exposed himself to the sun too much yesterday, but since it came of his earnest desire to learn, and to make this journey as useful as the opportunities will allow, no one seeks to discourage him by fault-finding. We missed him an hour from the camp, and then found him some distance away, by the edge of a brook, and with no umbrella to protect him from the fierce sun. If he had been used to going without his umbrella, it would have been well enough, of course, but he was not. He was just in the act of throwing a clod at a mud turtle, which was sunning itself on a small log in the brook. We said, "Don't do that, Jack. What do you want to harm him for? What has he done?" "Well then, I won't kill him, but I ought to because he is a fraud." We asked him why, but he said it was no matter. We asked him why, once or twice, as we walked back to the camp, but he still said it was no matter. But late at night, when he was sitting in a thoughtful mood on the bed, we asked him again and he said, "Well, it don't matter. I don't mind it now, but I did not like it today, you know, because I don't tell anything that isn't so, and I don't think the colonel ought to either." But he did. He told us at prayers in the pilgrims' tent last night, and he seemed as if he was reading it out of the Bible, too, about this country flowing with milk and honey, and about the voice of the turtle being heard in the land. I thought that was drawing it a little strong, about the turtles anyhow, but I asked Mr. Church if it was so, and he said it was, and what Mr. Church tells me, I believe. But I sat there and watched that turtle nearly an hour today, and I almost burned up in the sun, but I never heard him sing. I believe I sweated a double handful of sweat. No, I did because it got in my eyes, and it was running down over my nose all the time. And you know my pants are tighter than any body else's Paris foolishness, and the buckskin seat of them got wet with sweat, and then got dry again and began to draw up and pinch and tear loose. It was awful, but I never heard him sing. Finally I said, "This is a fraud, that is what it is. It is a fraud, and if I had had any sense, I might have known a cursed mud turtle couldn't sing." And then I said, "I don't wish to be hard on this fellow, and I will just give him 10 minutes to commence. 10 minutes, and then if he don't, down goes his building." But he didn't commence, you know. I had stayed there all that time, thinking maybe he might pretty soon, because he kept on raising his head up and letting it down, and drawing the skin over his eyes for a minute and then opening them out again, as if he was trying to study up something to sing. But just as the 10 minutes were up and I was all beat out and blistered, he laid his blamed head down on a knot and went fast asleep. It was a little hard, after you had waited so long. I should think so. I said, well, if you won't sing, you shan't sleep, anyway. And if you fellows had let me alone, I would have made him shin out of Galilee quicker than any turtle ever did yet. But it isn't any matter, now let it go. The skin is all off the back of my neck. About 10 in the morning, we halted at Joseph's Pit. This is a ruined khan of the Middle Ages, in one of whose side courts is a great walled and arched pit with water in it. And this pit, one tradition says, is the one Joseph's brethren cast him into. A more authentic tradition, aided by the geography of the country, places the pit in Dothan, some 2 days' journey from here. However, since there are many who believe in this present pit as the true one, it has its interest. It is hard to make a choice of the most beautiful passage in a book which is so gemmed with beautiful passages as the Bible. But it is certain that not many things within its lids may take rank above the exquisite story of Joseph, who taught those ancient writers their simplicity of language, their felicity of expression, their pathos, and above all, their faculty of sinking themselves entirely out of sight of the reader and making the narrative stand out alone and seem to tell itself. Shakespeare is always present when one reads his book. Macaulay is present when we follow the march of his stately sentences, but the Old Testament writers are hidden from view. If the pit I have been speaking of is the right one, a scene transpired there, long ages ago, which is familiar to us all in pictures. The sons of Jacob had been pasturing their flocks near there. Their father grew uneasy at their long absence, and sent Joseph, his favorite, to see if anything had gone wrong with them. He traveled 6 or 7 days' journey. He was only 17 years old, and boylike, he toiled through that long stretch of the vilest, rockiest, dustiest country in Asia, arrayed in the pride of his heart, his beautiful clawhammer coat of many colors. Joseph was the favorite, and that was one crime in the eyes of his brethren. He had dreamed dreams, and interpreted them to foreshadow his elevation far above all his family in the far future, and that was another. He was dressed well, and had doubtless displayed the harmless vanity of youth in keeping the fact prominently before his brothers. These were crimes his elders fretted over among themselves, and proposed to punish when the opportunity should offer. When they saw him coming up from the Sea of Galilee, they recognized him and were glad. They said, "Lo, here is this dreamer, let us kill him." But Reuben pleaded for his life, and they spared it. But they seized the boy, and stripped the hated coat from his back and pushed him into the pit. They intended to let him die there, but Reuben intended to liberate him secretly. However, while Reuben was away for a little while, the brethren sold Joseph to some Ishmaelitish merchants who were journeying towards Egypt. Such is the history of the pit. And the self-same pit is there in that place, even to this day. And there it will remain until the next detachment of image breakers and tomb desecrators arrives from the Quaker City excursion, and they will infallibly dig it up and carry it away with them. For behold, in them is no reverence for the solemn monuments of the past, and whithersoever they go they destroy and spare not. Joseph became rich, distinguished, powerful as the Bible expresses it, lord over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was the real king, the strength, the brain of the monarchy, though Pharaoh held the title. Joseph is one of the truly great men of the Old Testament. And he was the noblest and the manliest, save Esau. Why shall we not say a good word for the princely Bedouin? The only crime that can be brought against him is that he was unfortunate. Why must everybody praise Joseph's great-hearted generosity to his cruel brethren, without stint of fervent language, and fling only a reluctant bone of praise to Esau for his still sublimer generosity to the brother who had wronged him? Jacob took advantage of Esau's consuming hunger to rob him of his birthright and the great honor and consideration that belonged to the position. By treachery and falsehood, he robbed him of his father's blessing. He made of him a stranger in his home and a wanderer. Yet after 20 years had passed away, and Jacob met Esau and fell at his feet, quaking with fear and begging piteously to be spared the punishment he knew he deserved. What did that magnificent savage do? He fell upon his neck and embraced him. When Jacob, who was incapable of comprehending nobility of character, still doubting, still fearing, insisted upon finding grace with my lord, by the bribe of a present of cattle, what did the gorgeous son of the desert say? Nay, I have enough, my brother, keep that thou hast unto thyself. Esau found Jacob rich, beloved by wives and children, and traveling in state, with servants, herds of cattle and trains of camels, but he himself was still the uncorded outcast this brother had made him. After 13 years of romantic mystery, the brethren who had wronged Joseph came, strangers in a strange land, hungry and humble, to buy a little food. And being summoned to a palace, charged with crime, they beheld in its owner their wronged brother. They were trembling beggars, he, the lord of a mighty empire. What Joseph that ever lived would have thrown away such a chance to show off? Who stands first outcast Esau, forgiving Jacob in prosperity, or Joseph on a king's throne, forgiving the ragged tremblers, whose happy rascality placed him there? Just before we came to Joseph's pit, we had raised a hill, and there, a few miles before us, with not a tree or a shrub to interrupt the view, lay a vision which millions of worshippers in the far lands of the earth would give half their possessions to see the sacred Sea of Galilee. Therefore we tarried only a short time at the pit. We rested the horses and ourselves, and felt for a few minutes the blessed shade of the ancient buildings. We were out of water, but the 2 or 3 scowling Arabs, with their long guns, who were idling about the place, said they had none and that there was none in the vicinity. They knew there was a little brackish water in the pit, but they venerated a place made sacred by their ancestors' imprisonment too much to be willing to see Christian dogs drink from it. But Ferguson tied rags and handkerchiefs together till he made a rope long enough to lower a vessel to the bottom, and we drank and then rowed on. And in a short time we dismounted on those shores, which the feet of the Savior have made holy ground. At noon we took a swim in the Sea of Galilee, a blessed privilege in this roasting climatand, then lunched under a neglected old fig tree at the fountain they call Ainettin, 100 yards from ruined Capernaum. Every rivulet that gurgles out of the rocks and sands of this part of the world is dubbed with the title of fountain, and people familiar with the Hudson, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi fall into transports of admiration over them and exhaust their powers of composition in writing their praises. If all the poetry and nonsense that have been discharged upon the fountains and the bland scenery of this region were collected in a book, it would make a most valuable volume to burn. During luncheon, the pilgrim enthusiasts of our party, who had been so light-hearted and so happy ever since they touched holy ground that they did little but mutter incoherent rhapsodies, could scarcely eat, so anxious were they to take shipping and sail in very person upon the waters that had borne the vessels of the apostles. Their anxiety grew and their excitement augmented with every fleeting moment, until my fears were aroused, and I began to have misgivings that in their present condition they might break recklessly loose from all considerations of prudence and buy a whole fleet of ships to sail in instead of hiring a single one for an hour, as quiet folk are wont to do. I trembled to think of the ruined purses this day's performances might result in. I could not help reflecting bodingly upon the intemperate zeal with which middle-aged men are apt to surfeit themselves upon a seductive folly which they have tasted for the first time. And yet I did not feel that I had a right to be surprised at the state of things which was giving me so much concern. These men had been taught from infancy to revere, almost to worship, the holy places whereon their happy eyes were resting now. For many and many a year, this very picture had visited their thoughts by day and floated through their dreams by night. To stand before it in the fleshta, see it as they saw it now to sail upon the hallowed sea, and kiss the holy soil that compassed it about. These were aspirations they had cherished, while a generation dragged its lagging seasons by and left its furrows in their faces and its frosts upon their hair. To look upon this picture and sail upon this sea, they had forsaken home and its idols and journeyed thousands and thousands of miles, in weariness and tribulation. What wonder that the sordid lights of workday prudence should pale before the glory of a hope like theirs in the full splendor of its fruition. Let them squander millions. I said, who speaks of money at a time like this? In this frame of mind I followed, as fast as I could, the eager footsteps of the pilgrims, and stood upon the shore of the lake, and swelled, with hat and voice, the frantic hail they sent after the ship that was speeding by. It was a success. The toilers of the sea ran in and beached their bark. Joy sat upon every countenance. How much, ask him how much, Ferguson? How much to take us all 8 of us, and you to Bethsaida yonder, and to the mouth of Jordan, and to the place where the swine ran down into the sea quick, and we want to coast around everywhere, all day long. I could sail a year in these waters, and tell him we'll stop at Magdala and finish at Tiberias, ask him how much, anything whatever, tell him we don't care what the expense is. I said to myself, I knew how it would be. Ferguson, interpreting, he says 2 Napoleons $8. 1 or 2 countenances fell. Then a pause. Too much, we'll give him 1. I never shall know how it was. I shudder yet, when I think how the place is given to miracles, but in a single instant of time, as it seemed to me, that ship was 20 paces from the shore, and speeding away like a frightened thing. 8 crestfallen creatures stood upon the shore, and oh, to think of it. This after all that overmastering ecstasy. Oh, shameful ending, after such unseemly boasting. It was too much like, ho. Let me at him, followed by a prudent 2 of you hold him, 1 can hold me. Instantly, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth in the camp. The 2 Napoleons were offered more, if necessary, and pilgrims and dragomen shouted themselves hoarse, with pleadings to the retreating boatmen to come back. But they sailed serenely away, and paid no further heed to pilgrims who had dreamed all their lives of some day skimming over the sacred waters of Galilee, and listening to its hallowed story and the whisperings of its waves, and had journeyed countless leagues to do it, and then concluded that the fare was too high. Impertinent Mohammedan Arabs, to think such things of gentlemen of another faith. Well, there was nothing to do but just submit and forgo the privilege of voyaging on Gennesaret, after coming half around the globe to taste that pleasure. There was a time, when the Savior taught here, that boats were plenty among the fishermen of the coasts, but boats and fishermen both are gone now. And old Josephus had a fleet of men of war in these waters 18 centuries ago, 130 bold canoes, but they, also, have passed away and left no sign. They battle here no more by sea, and the commercial marine of Galilee numbers only 2 small ships, just of a pattern with the little skiffs the disciples knew. One was lost to us, for good the other was miles away and far out of hail. So we mounted the horses and rode grimly on toward Magdala, cantering along in the edge of the water for want of the means of passing over it. How the pilgrims abused each other! Each said it was the other's fault, and each in turn denied it. No word was spoken by the sinners, even the mildest sarcasm might have been dangerous at such a time. Sinners that have been kept down and had examples held up to them, and suffered frequent lectures, and been so put upon in a moral way and in the matter of going slow and being serious and bottling up slang, and so crowded in regard to the matter of being proper and always and forever behaving, that their lives have become a burden to them, would not lag behind pilgrims at such a time as this, and wink furtively, and be joyful, and commit other such crimes because it would not occur to them to do it. Otherwise they would. But they did do it, though it did them a world of good to hear the pilgrims abuse each other too. We took an unworthy satisfaction in seeing them fall out, now and then, because it showed that they were only poor human people like us, after all. So we all rode down to Magdala, while the gnashing of teeth waxed and waned by turns, and harsh words troubled the holy calm of Galilee. Lest any man think I mean to be ill-natured when I talk about our pilgrims as I have been talking, I wish to say in all sincerity that I do not. I would not listen to lectures from men I did not like and could not respect, and none of these can say I ever took their lectures unkindly, or was restive under the infliction, or failed to try to profit by what they said to me. They are better men than I am. I can say that honestly. They are good friends of mine, too, and besides, if they did not wish to be stirred up occasionally in print, why in the mischief did they travel with me? They knew me. They knew my liberal way that, like to give and take when it is for me to give and other people to take. When one of them threatened to leave me in Damascus when I had the cholera, he had no real idea of doing it. I know his passionate nature and the good impulses that underlie it. And did I not overhear church, another pilgrim, say he did not care who went or who stayed. He would stand by me till I walked out of Damascus on my own feet or was carried out in a coffin, if it was a year. And do I not include church? Every time I abuse the pilgrim's end, would I be likely to speak ill-naturedly of him? I wish to stir them up and make them healthy, that is all. We had left Capernaum behind us. It was only a shapeless ruin. It bore no semblance to a town, and had nothing about it to suggest that it had ever been a town. But all desolate and unpeopled as it was illustrious ground. From it sprang that tree of Christianity, whose broad arms overshadow so many distant lands today. After Christ was tempted of the devil in the desert, he came here and began his teachings. And during the 3 or 4 years he lived afterward, this place was his home almost altogether. He began to heal the sick, and his fame soon spread so widely that sufferers came from Syria and beyond Jordan, and even from Jerusalem, several days' journey away, to be cured of their diseases. Here he healed the centurion's servant and Peter's mother-in-law, and multitudes of the lame and the blind and persons possessed of devils. And here, also, he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He went into a ship with his disciples, and when they roused him from sleep in the midst of a storm, he quieted the winds and lulled the troubled sea to rest with his voice. He passed over to the other side, a few miles away, and relieved 2 men of devils, which passed into some swine. After his return, he called Matthew from the receipt of customs, performed some cures, and created scandal by eating with publicans and sinners. Then he went healing and teaching through Galilee, and even journeyed to Tyre and Sidon. He chose the 12 disciples and sent them abroad to preach the new gospel. He worked miracles in Bethsaida and quarries in villages 2 or 3 miles from Capernaum. It was near one of them that the miraculous draught of fishes is supposed to have been taken, and it was in the desert places near the other that he fed the thousands by the miracles of the loaves and fishes. He cursed them both, and Capernaum also, for not repenting after all the great works he had done in their midst, and prophesied against them. They are all in ruins, now, which is gratifying to the pilgrims, for, as usual, they fit the eternal words of God's to the evanescent things of this earth. Christ, it is more probable, referred to the people, not their shabby villages of wigwams. He said it would be sad for them at the day of judgment, and what business have mud hovels at the day of judgment? It would not affect the prophecy in the least. It would neither prove it or disprove it if these towns were splendid cities, now instead of the almost vanished ruins they are. Christ visited Magdala, which is near by Capernaum, and he also visited Caesarea Philippi. He went up to his old home at Nazareth, and saw his brothers Hoseas and Judas and James and Simon, those persons who, being own brothers to Jesus Christ, one would expect to hear mentioned sometimes, yet whoever saw their names in a newspaper or heard them from a pulpit? Whoever inquires what manner of youths they were, and whether they slept with Jesus, played with him and romped about him, quarreled with him concerning toys and trifles, struck him in anger, not suspecting what he was. Whoever wonders what they thought when they saw him come back to Nazareth a celebrity, and looked long at his unfamiliar face to make sure, and then said, "It is Jesus." Who wonders what passed in their minds when they saw this brother, who was only a brother to them, however much he might be to others a mysterious stranger who was a god, and had stood face to face with God above the clouds, doing strange miracles with crowds of astonished people for witnesses? Who wonders if the brothers of Jesus asked him to come home with them, and said his mother and his sisters were grieved at his long absence, and would be wild with delight to see his face again? Whoever gives a thought to the sisters of Jesus at all, yet he had sisters, and memories of them must have stolen into his mind often when he was ill-treated among strangers, when he was homeless, and said he had not where to lay his head, when all deserted him, even Peter, and he stood alone among his enemies. Christ did few miracles in Nazareth, and stayed but a little while. The people said, "This the Son of God. Why, his father is nothing but a carpenter." We know the family. We see them every day. Are not his brothers named so and so, and his sisters so and so, and is not his mother the person they call Mary? This is absurd. He did not curse his home, but he shook its dust from his feet and went away. Capernaum lies close to the edge of the little sea. in a small plain some 5 miles long and a mile or two wide, which is mildly adorned with oleanders, which look all the better contrasted with the bald hills and the howling deserts which surround them. But they are not as deliriously beautiful as the books paint them. If one be calm and resolute, he can look upon their comeliness and live. One of the most astonishing things that have yet fallen under our observation is the exceedingly small portion of the earth from which sprang the now flourishing plant of Christianity. The longest journey our Savior ever performed was from here to Jerusalem, about 100 to 120 miles. The next longest was from here to Sidonsay, about 60 or 70 miles. Instead of being wide apart as American appreciation of distances would naturally suggest, the places made most particularly celebrated by the presence of Christ are nearly all right here in full view, and within cannon shot of Capernaum. Leaving out 2 or 3 short journeys of the Savior, he spent his life, preached his gospel, and performed his miracles within a compass no larger than an ordinary county in the United States. It is as much as I can do to comprehend this stupefying fact. How it wears a man out to have to read up 100 pages of history every 2 or 3 miles for, verily, the celebrated localities of Palestine occur that close together. How wearily, how bewilderingly they swarm about your path. In due time, we reach the ancient village of Magdala. Chapter 48. Magdala is not a beautiful place. It is thoroughly Syrian, and that is to say that it is thoroughly ugly, and cramped, squalid, uncomfortable, and filthy, just the style of cities that have adorned the country since Adam's time, as all writers have labored hard to prove, and have succeeded. The streets of Magdala are anywhere from 3 to 6 feet wide, and reeking with uncleanliness. The houses are from 5 to 7 feet high, and all built upon one arbitrary plan, the ungraceful form of a dry goods box. The sides are daubed with a smooth white plaster, and tastefully frescoed aloft and alow with discs of camel dung placed there to dry. This gives the edifice the romantic appearance of having been riddled with cannonballs, and imparts to it a very warlike aspect. When the artist has arranged his materials with an eye to just proportion the small and the large flakes in alternate rows, and separated by carefully considered intervals, I know of nothing more cheerful to look upon than a spirited Syrian fresco. The flat, plastered roof is garnished by picturesque stacks of fresco materials, which, having become thoroughly dried and cured, are placed there where it will be convenient. It is used for fuel. There is no timber of any consequence in Palestine, none at all to waste upon fires, and neither are there any mines of coal. If my description has been intelligible, you will perceive now that a square, flat-roofed hovel, neatly frescoed, with its wall tops gallantly bastioned and turreted with dried camel refuse, gives to a landscape a feature that is exceedingly festive and picturesque, especially if one is careful to remember to stick in a cat wherever, about the premises, there is room for a cat to sit. There are no windows to a Syrian hut, and no chimneys. When I used to read that they let a bedridden man down through the roof of a house in Capernaum to get him into the presence of the Savior, I generally had a 3-story brick in my mind, and marveled that they did not break his neck with the strange experiment. I perceive now, however, that they might have taken him by the heels and thrown him clear over the house without discommoding him very much. Palestine is not changed any since those days, in manners, customs, architecture, or people. As we rode into Magdala, not a soul was visible. But the ring of the horses' hoofs roused the stupid population, and they all came trooping out, old men and old women, boys and girls, the blind, the crazy, and the crippled, all in ragged, soiled, and scanty raiment, and all abject beggars by nature, instinct, and education. How the vermin-tortured vagabonds did swarm! How they showed their scars and sores, and piteously pointed to their maimed and crooked limbs, and begged with their pleading eyes for charity. We had invoked a spirit we could not lay. They hung to the horses' tails, clung to their manes and the stirrups, closed in on every aid in scorn of dangerous hoof-sand out of their infidel throats, with one accord, burst an agonizing and most infernal chorus. Hawaji bucksheesh. Hawaji bucksheesh. Hawaji bucksheesh. Bucksheesh. Bucksheesh, I never was in a storm like that before. As we paid the bucksheesh out to sore-eyed children and brown, buxom girls with repulsively tattooed lips and chins, we filed through the town and by many an exquisite fresco, till we came to a bramble-infested enclosure and a Roman-looking ruin which had been the veritable dwelling of Saint Mary Magdalene, the friend and follower of Jesus. The guide believed it, and so did I. I could not well do otherwise, with the house right there before my eyes as plain as day. The pilgrims took down portions of the front wall for specimens, as is their honored custom, and then we departed. We are camped in this place, now, just within the city walls of Tiberias. We went into the town before nightfall, and looked at its people. We cared nothing about its houses. Its people are best examined at a distance. They are particularly uncomely Jews, Arabs, and Negroes. Squalor and poverty are the pride of Tiberias. The young women wear their dower strung upon a strong wire that curves downward from the top of the head to the jaw Turkish silver coins, which they have raked together or inherited. Most of these maidens were not wealthy, but some few had been very kindly dealt with by fortune. I saw heiresses their worth in their own right worth, well, I suppose I might venture to say, as much as $9.50. But such cases are rare. When you come across one of these, she naturally puts on airs. She will not ask for bucksheesh. She will not even permit of undue familiarity. She assumes a crushing dignity, and goes on serenely practicing with her fine-tooth comb and quoting poetry, just the same as if you were not present at all. Some people cannot stand prosperity. They say that the long-nosed, lanky, dyspeptic-looking body snatchers, with the indescribable hats on, and a long curl dangling down in front of each ear, are the old, familiar, self-righteous Pharisees we read of in the Scriptures. Verily, they look it. Judging merely by their general style, and without other evidence, one might easily suspect that self-righteousness was their specialty. From various authorities, I have culled information concerning Tiberias. It was built by Herod Antipas, the murderer of John the Baptist, and named after the Emperor Tiberius. It is believed that it stands upon the site of what must have been, ages ago, a city of considerable architectural pretensions, judging by the fine porphyry pillars that are scattered through Tiberias and down the lake shore southward. These were fluted once, and yet, although the stone is about as hard as iron, the flutings are almost worn away. These pillars are small, and doubtless the edifices they adorned were distinguished more for elegance than grandeur. This modern town Tiberias is only mentioned in the New Testament, never in the Old. The Sanhedrim met here last, and for 300 years Tiberias was the metropolis of the Jews in Palestine. It is one of the 4 holy cities of the Israelites, and is to them what Mecca is to the Mohammedan and Jerusalem to the Christian. It has been the abiding place of many learned and famous Jewish rabbins. They lie buried here, and near them lie also 25,000 of their faith who traveled far to be near them, while they lived and lie with them when they died. The great Rabbi Ben Israel spent 3 years here in the early part of the 3rd century. He is dead now. The celebrated Sea of Galilee is not so large a sea as Lake Tahoe. I measure all lakes by Tahoe, partly because I am far more familiar with it than with any other, and partly because I have such a high admiration for it and such a world of pleasant recollections of it, that it is very nearly impossible for me to speak of lakes and not mention it. By a good deal it is just about 2/3 as large. And when we come to speak of beauty, this sea is no more to be compared to Tahoe than a meridian of longitude is to a rainbow. The dim waters of this pool cannot suggest the limpid brilliancy of Tahoe. These low, shaven, yellow hillocks of rocks and sand, so devoid of perspective, cannot suggest the grand peaks that compass Tahoe like a wall, and whose ribbed and chasmed fronts are clad with stately pines that seem to grow small and smaller as they climb, till one might fancy them reduced to weeds and shrubs far upward, where they join the everlasting snows. Silence and solitude brood over Tahoe, and silence and solitude brood also over this lake of Gennesaret. But the solitude of the one is as cheerful and fascinating as the solitude of the other is dismal and repellent. In the early morning, one watches the silent battle of dawn and darkness upon the waters of Tahoe with a placid interest. But when the shadows sulk away, and one by one the hidden beauties of the shore unfold themselves in the full splendor of noon, when the still surface is belted like a rainbow with broad bars of blue and green and white, half the distance from circumference to center. When, in the lazy summer afternoon, he lies in a boat, far out to where the dead blue of the deep water begins, and smokes the pipe of peace, and idly winks at the distant crags and patches of snow from under his cap brim. When the boat drifts shoreward to the white water, and he lolls over the gunwale and gazes by the hour down through the crystal depths, and notes the colors of the pebbles, and reviews the finny armies gliding in procession 100 feet below. When at night he sees moon and stars, mountain ridges feathered with pines, jutting white capes, bold promontories, grand sweeps of rugged scenery topped with bald, glimmering peaks, all magnificently pictured in the polished mirror of the lake, in richest, softest detail, the tranquil interest that was born with the morning deepens and deepens, by sure degrees, till it culminates at last in resistless fascination. It is solitude, for birds and squirrels on the shore and fishes in the water are all the creatures that are near to make it otherwise, but it is not the sort of solitude to make one dreary. Come to Galilee for that. If these unpeopled deserts, these rusty mounds of barrenness, that never do shake the glare from their harsh outlines, and fade and faint into vague perspective, that melancholy ruin of Capernaum, this stupid village of Tiberias, slumbering under its 6 funereal plumes of palms, yonder desolate declivity where the swine of the miracle ran down into the sea, and doubtless thought it was better to swallow a devil or two and get drowned into the bargain than have to live longer in such a place, this cloudless, blistering sky. This solemn, sailless, tintless lake, reposing within its rim of yellow hills and low, steep banks, and looking just as expressionless and unpoetical, when we leave its sublime history out of the question. As any metropolitan reservoir in Christendom, if these things are not food for rock-me to sleep, mother, none exist, I think. But I should not offer the evidence for the prosecution and leave the defense unheard. W.M. 100. Grimes deposes as follows. We had taken ship to go over to the other side. The sea was not more than 6 miles wide. Of the beauty of the scene, however, I cannot say enough, nor can I imagine where those travelers carried their eyes who have described the scenery of the lake as tame or uninteresting. The first great characteristic of it is the deep basin in which it lies. This is from 300 to 400 feet deep on all sides except at the lower end, and the sharp slope of the banks, which are all of the richest green, is broken and diversified by the wadies and watercourses which work their way down through the sides of the basin, forming dark chasms or light sunny valleys. Near Tiberias these banks are rocky, and ancient sepulchres open in them, with their doors toward the water. They selected grand spots, as did the Egyptians of old, for burial places, as if they designed that when the voice of God should reach the sleepers, they should walk forth and open their eyes on scenes of glorious beauty. On the east, the wild and desolate mountains contrast finely with the deep blue lake, and toward the north, sublime and majestic, Hermon looks down on the sea, lifting his white crown to heaven with the pride of a hill that has seen the departing footsteps of 100 generations. On the northeast shore of the sea was a single tree, and this is the only tree of any size visible from the water of the lake, except a few lonely palms in the city of Tiberias, and by its solitary position attracts more attention than would a forest. The whole appearance of the scene is precisely what we would expect and desire the scenery of Gennesaret to be, grand beauty, but quiet calm. The very mountains are calm. It is an ingeniously written description, and well calculated to deceive. But if the paint and the ribbons and the flowers be stripped from it, a skeleton will be found beneath. So stripped, there remains a lake 6 miles wide and neutral in color, with steep green banks unrelieved by shrubbery, at one end bare unsightly rocks with almost invisible holes in them of no consequence to the picture, eastward, wild and desolate mountains. Low, desolate hills, he should have said. In the north, a mountain called Hermon with snow on it, peculiarity of the picture, calmness, its prominent feature, one tree. No ingenuity could make such a picture beautiful to one's actual vision. I claim the right to correct misstatements, and have so corrected the color of the water in the above recapitulation. The waters of Gennesaret are of an exceedingly mild blue, even from a high elevation and a distance of 5 miles. Close at hand, the witness was sailing on the lake. It is hardly proper to call them blue at all, much less deep blue. I wish to state, also, not as a correction, but as matter of opinion, that Mount Hermon is not a striking or picturesque mountain by any means, being too near the height of its immediate neighbors to be so. That is all. I do not object to the witness dragging a mountain 45 miles to help the scenery under consideration, because it is entirely proper to do it, and besides, the picture needs it. 100. W. E. of Life in the Holy Land deposes as follows. A beautiful sea lies unbosomed among the Galilean hills, in the midst of that land once possessed by Zebulun and Naphtali, Asher and Dan. The azure of the sky penetrates the depths of the lake, and the waters are sweet and cool. On the west stretch broad fertile plains. On the north the rocky shores rise step by step, until in the far distance tower the snowy heights of Hermon. On the east through a misty veil are seen the high plains of Perea, which stretch away in rugged mountains leading the mind by varied paths toward Jerusalem the Holy. Flowers bloom in this terrestrial paradise, once beautiful and verdant with waving trees. Singing birds enchant the ear, the turtle dove soothes with its soft note. The crested lark sends up its song toward heaven, and the grave and stately stork inspires the mind with thought and leads it on to meditation and repose. Life here was once idyllic, charming. Here were once no rich, no poor, no high, no low. It was a world of ease, simplicity, and beauty. Now it is a scene of desolation and misery. This is not an ingenious picture. It is the worst I ever saw. It describes in elaborate detail what it terms a terrestrial paradise, and closes with the startling information that this paradise is a scene of desolation and misery. I have given two fair, average specimens of the character of the testimony offered by the majority of the writers who visit this region. One says, "Of the beauty of the scene one cannot say enough," and then proceeds to cover up with a woof of glittering sentences a thing which, when stripped for inspection, proves to be only an unobtrusive basin of water, some mountainous desolation, and one tree. The other, after a conscientious effort to build a terrestrial paradise out of the same materials, with the addition of a grave and stately stork, spoils it all by blundering upon the ghastly truth at the last. Nearly every book concerning Galilee and its lake describes the scenery as beautiful. No, not always so straightforward as that. Sometimes the impression intentionally conveyed is that it is beautiful, at the same time that the author is careful not to say that it is, in plain Saxon. But a careful analysis of these descriptions will show that the materials of which they are formed are not individually beautiful, and cannot be wrought into combinations that are beautiful. The veneration and the affection which some of these men felt for the scenes they were speaking of heated their fancies and biased their judgment, but the pleasant falsities they wrote were full of honest sincerity, at any rate. Others wrote as they did, because they feared it would be unpopular to write otherwise. Others were hypocrites and deliberately meant to deceive. Any of them would say in a moment, if asked, that it was always right and always best to tell the truth. They would say that, at any rate, if they did not perceive the drift of the question. But why should not the truth be spoken of this region? Is the truth harmful? Has it ever needed to hide its face? God made the Sea of Galilee and its surroundings as they are. Is it the province of Mr. Grimes to improve upon the work? I am sure, from the tenor of books I have read, that many who have visited this land in years gone by were Presbyterians and came seeking evidences in support of their particular creed. They found a Presbyterian Palestine, and they had already made up their minds to find no other, though possibly they did not know it, being blinded by their zeal. Others were Baptists, seeking Baptist evidences and a Baptist Palestine. Others were Catholics, Methodists, Episcopalians, seeking evidences endorsing their several creeds, and a Catholic, a Methodist, an Episcopalian Palestine. Honest as these men's intentions may have been, they were full of partialities and prejudices. They entered the country with their verdicts already prepared, and they could no more write dispassionately and impartially about it than they could about their own wives and children. Our pilgrims have brought their verdicts with them. They have shown it in their conversation ever since we left Berout. I can almost tell, in set phrase, what they will say when they see Tabor, Nazareth, Jericho, and Jerusalem because I have the books they will smouch their ideas from. These authors write pictures and frame rhapsodies, and lesser men follow and see with the author's eyes instead of their own, and speak with his tongue. What the pilgrims said at Caesarea Philippi surprised me with its wisdom. I found it afterwards in Robinson. What they said when Gennesaret burst upon their vision charmed me with its grace. I find it in Mr. Thompson's Land and the Book. They have spoken often, in happily worded language which never varied, of how they mean to lay their weary heads upon a stone at Bethel, as Jacob did, and close their dim eyes, and dream, perchance, of angels descending out of heaven on a ladder. It was very pretty. But I have recognized the weary head, and the dim eyes, finally. They borrowed the idea end, the words end, the construction end, the punctuation from Grimes. The pilgrims will tell of Palestine, when they get home, not as it appeared to them, but as it appeared to Thompson and Robinson and Grimes with, the tints varied to suit each pilgrim's creed. Pilgrims, sinners, and Arabs are all abed now, and the camp is still. Labor and loneliness is irksome. Since I made my last few notes, I have been sitting outside the tent for half an hour. Night is the time to see Galilee. Gennesaret under these lustrous stars has nothing repulsive about it. Gennesaret, with the glittering reflections of the constellations flecking its surface, almost makes me regret that I ever saw the rude glare of the day upon it. Its history and its associations are its chiefest charm in any eyes, and the spells they weave are feeble in the searching light of the sun. Then we scarcely feel the fetters. Our thoughts wander constantly to the practical concerns of life, and refuse to dwell upon things that seem vague and unreal. But when the day is done, even the most unimpressible must yield to the dreamy influences of this tranquil starlight. The old traditions of the place steal upon his memory and haunt his reveries, and then his fancy clothes all sights and sounds with the supernatural. In the lapping of the waves upon the beach, he hears the dip of ghostly oars. In the secret noises of the night, he hears spirit voices. In the soft sweep of the breeze, the rush of invisible wings. Phantom ships are on the sea, the dead of 20 centuries come forth from the tombs, and in the dirges of the night wind, the songs of old forgotten ages find utterance again. In the starlight, Galilee has no boundaries but the broad compass of the heavens, and is a theater meet for great events, meet for the birth of a religion able to save a world, and meet for the stately figure appointed to stand upon its stage and proclaim its high decrees. But in the sunlight, one says, is it for the deeds which were done, and the words which were spoken in this little acre of rocks and sand 18 centuries gone, that the bells are ringing today in the remote islands of the sea and far and wide over continents that clasp the circumference of the huge globe? One can comprehend it only when night has hidden all incongruities and created a theater proper for so grand a drama. Chapter 49. We took another swim in the Sea of Galilee at twilight yesterday, and another at sunrise this morning. We have not sailed, but 3 swims are equal to a sail, are they not? There were plenty of fish visible in the water, but we have no outside aids in this pilgrimage but tent life in the Holy Land, the Land and the Book, and other literature of like description. No fishing tackle. There were no fish to be had in the village of Tiberias. True, we saw 2 or 3 vagabonds mending their nets, but never trying to catch anything with them. We did not go to the ancient warm baths 2 miles below Tiberias. I had no desire in the world to go there. This seemed a little strange, and prompted me to try to discover what the cause of this unreasonable indifference was. It turned out to be simply because Pliny mentions them. I have conceived a sort of unwarrantable unfriendliness toward Pliny and St. Paul, because it seems as if I can never ferret out a place that I can have to myself. It always and eternally transpires that St. Paul has been to that place, and Pliny has mentioned it. In the early morning, we mounted and started. And then a weird apparition marched forth at the head of the procession. A pirate, I thought, if ever a pirate dwelt upon land. It was a tall Arab, as swarthy as an Indian, young, say 30 years of age. On his head he had closely bound a gorgeous yellow and red striped silk scarf, whose ends, lavishly fringed with tassels, hung down between his shoulders and dallied with the wind. From his neck to his knees, in ample folds, a robe swept down that was a very star-spangled banner of curved and sinuous bars of black and white. Out of his back, somewhere apparently, the long stem of a chibok projected and reached far above his right shoulder. Athwart his back, diagonally, and extending high above his left shoulder, was an Arab gun of Saladin's time that was splendid with silver plating from stock clear up to the end of its measureless stretch of barrel. About his waist was bound many and many a yard of elaborately figured but sadly tarnished stuff that came from sumptuous Persia. And among the baggy folds in front, the sunbeams glinted from a formidable battery of old brass-mounted horse pistols and the gilded hilts of bloodthirsty knives. There were holsters for more pistols appended to the wonderful stack of long-haired goatskins and Persian carpets, which the man had been taught to regard in the light of a saddle. And down among the pendulous rank of vast tassels that swung from that saddle, and clanging against the iron shovel of a stirrup that propped the warrior's knees up toward his chin, was a crooked, silver-clad scimitar of such awful dimensions and such implacable expression that no man might hope to look upon it and not shudder. The fringed and bedizened prince whose privilege it is to ride the pony and lead the elephant into a country village is poor and naked compared to this chaos of paraphernalia. And the happy vanity of the one is the very poverty of satisfaction compared to the majestic serenity, the overwhelming complacency of the other. Who is this? What is this? That was the trembling inquiry all down the line. Our guard. From Galilee to the birthplace of the Savior, the country is infested with fierce Bedouins, whose sole happiness it is, in this life, to cut and stab and mangle and murder unoffending Christians. Allah be with us. Then hire a regiment. Would you send us out among these desperate hordes, with no salvation in our utmost need but this old turret? The dragoman laughed not at the facetiousness of the simile, for verily, that guide or that courier or that dragoman never yet lived upon earth who had in him the faintest appreciation of a joke, even though that joke were so broad and so ponderous that if it fell on him it would flat him out like a postage stamp. The dragoman laughed. And then, emboldened by some thought that was in his brain, no doubt, proceeded to extremities and winked. In straits like these, when a man laughs, it is encouraging; when he winks, it is positively reassuring. He finally intimated that one guard would be sufficient to protect us, but that one was an absolute necessity. It was because of the moral weight his awful panoply would have with the Bedouins. Then I said we didn't want any guard at all. If one fantastic vagabond could protect 8 armed Christians and a pack of Arab servants from all harm, surely that detachment could protect themselves. He shook his head doubtfully. Then I said, just think of how it looks, think of how it would read to self-reliant Americans that we went sneaking through this deserted wilderness under the protection of this masquerading Arab, who would break his neck getting out of the country if a man that was a man ever started after him. It was a mean, low, degrading position. Why were we ever told to bring Navy revolvers with us if we had to be protected at last by this infamous star-spangled scum of the desert? These appeals were vain. The dragoman only smiled and shook his head. I rode to the front and struck up an acquaintance with King Solomon in all his glory, and got him to show me his lingering eternity of a gun. It had a rusty flintlock. It was ringed and barred and plated with silver from end to end, but it was as desperately out of the perpendicular as are the billiard cues of '49 that one finds yet in service in the ancient mining camps of California. The muzzle was eaten by the rust of centuries into a ragged filigree work, like the end of a burnt-out stovepipe. I shut one eye, and peered within. It was flaked with iron rust like an old steamboat boiler. I borrowed the ponderous pistols and snapped them. They were rusty inside; 2 had not been loaded for a generation. I went back, full of encouragement, and reported to the guide, and asked him to discharge this dismantled fortress. It came out then. This fellow was a retainer of the Sheikh of Tiberias. He was a source of government revenue. He was to the Empire of Tiberias what the customs are to America. The Sheikh imposed guards upon travelers and charged them for it. It is a lucrative source of emolument, and sometimes brings into the national treasury as much as $35 or $40 a year. I knew the warrior's secret now. I knew the hollow vanity of his rusty trumpery and despised his asinine complacency. I told on him, and with reckless daring, the cavalcade rode straight ahead into the perilous solitudes of the desert, and scorned his frantic warnings of the mutilation and death that hovered about them on every side. Arrived at an elevation of 1,200 feet above the lake, I ought to mention that the lake lies 600 feet below the level of the Mediterranean. No traveler ever neglects to flourish that fragment of news in his letters. As bald and unthrilling a panorama as any land can afford, perhaps, was spread out before us. Yet it was so crowded with historical interest that if all the pages that have been written about it were spread upon its surface, they would flag it from horizon to horizon like a pavement. Among the localities comprised in this view were Mount Hermon, the hills that border Caesarea Philippi, Dan, the sources of the Jordan and the waters of Merom, Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, Joseph's Pit, Capernaum, Bethsaida, the supposed scenes of the Sermon on the Mount, the feeding of the multitudes and the miraculous draught of fishes, the declivity down which the swine ran to the sea, the entrance and the exit of the Jordan. Safed, the city set upon a hill, one of the 4 holy cities of the Jews, and the place where they believe the real Messiah will appear when he comes to redeem the world. Part of the battlefield of Hattin, where the knightly crusaders fought their last fight, and in a blaze of glory passed from the stage and ended their splendid career forever. Mount Tabor, the traditional scene of the Lord's transfiguration. And down toward the southeast lay a landscape that suggested to my mind a quotation, imperfectly remembered, no doubt. The Ephraimites, not being called upon to share in the rich spoils of the Ammonitish war, assembled a mighty host to fight against Jephthah, judge of Israel, who, being apprised of their approach, gathered together the men of Israel and gave them battle and put them to flight. To make his victory the more secure, he stationed guards at the different fords and passages of the Jordan, with instructions to let none pass who could not say shibboleth. The Ephraimites, being of a different tribe, could not frame to pronounce the word right, but called it sibboleth, which proved them enemies and cost them their lives. Wherefore, 40 and 2,000 fell at the different fords and passages of the Jordan that day. We jogged along peacefully over the great caravan route from Damascus to Jerusalem and Egypt, past Lubia and other Syrian hamlets, perched, in the unvarying style, upon the summit of steep mounds and hills, and fenced round about with giant cactuses, the sign of worthless land, with prickly pears upon them like hams, and came at last to the battlefield of Hattin. It is a grand, irregular plateau, and looks as if it might have been created for a battlefield. Here the peerless Saladin met the Christian host some 700 years ago, and broke their power in Palestine for all time to come. There had long been a truce between the opposing forces, but according to the guidebook, Reynold of Chatelain, Lord of Kerak, broke it by plundering a Damascus caravan and refusing to give up either the merchants or their goods when Saladin demanded them. This conduct of an insolent petty chieftain stung the Sultan to the quick, and he swore that he would slaughter Reynold with his own hand, no matter how, or when, or where he found him. Both armies prepared for war. Under the weak king of Jerusalem was the very flower of the Christian chivalry. He foolishly compelled them to undergo a long, exhausting march in the scorching sun, and then, without water or other refreshment, ordered them to encamp in this open plain. The splendidly mounted masses of Moslem soldiers swept round the north end of Gennesaret, burning and destroying as they came, and pitched their camp in front of the opposing lines. At dawn the terrific fight began. Surrounded on all sides by the Sultan's swarming battalions, the Christian knights fought on without a hope for their lives. They fought with desperate valor, but to no purpose. The odds of heat and numbers and consuming thirst were too great against them. Towards the middle of the day, the bravest of their band cut their way through the Moslem ranks and gained the summit of a little hill. And there, hour after hour, they closed around the banner of the cross and beat back the charging squadrons of the enemy. But the doom of the Christian power was sealed. Sunset found Saladin Lord of Palestine, the Christian chivalry strewn in heaps upon the field, and the King of Jerusalem, the Grand Master of the Templars, and Reynold of Chatelain, captives in the Sultan's tent. Saladin treated 2 of the prisoners with princely courtesy, and ordered refreshments to be set before them. When the king handed an iced sherbet to Chatelain, the sultan said, "It is thou that givest it to him, not I." He remembered his oath, and slaughtered the hapless knight of Chatelain with his own hand. It was hard to realize that this silent plain had once resounded with martial music and trembled to the tramp of armed men. It was hard to people this solitude with rushing columns of cavalry, and stir its torpid pulses with the shouts of victors, the shrieks of the wounded, and the flash of banner and steel above the surging billows of war. A desolation is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. We reached Tabor safely, and considerably in advance of that old ironclad swindle of a guard. We never saw a human being on the whole route, much less lawless hordes of Bedouins. Tabor stands solitary and alone, a giant sentinel above the plain of Esdraelon. It rises some 1,400 feet above the surrounding level, a green, wooden cone symmetrical and full of grace-a prominent landmark, and one that is exceedingly pleasant to eyes, surfeited with the repulsive monotony of desert Syria. We climbed the steep path to its summit, through breezy glades of thorn and oak. The view presented from its highest peak was almost beautiful. Below was the broad, level plain of Esdraelon, checkered with fields like a chessboard, and full as smooth and level seemingly, dotted about its borders with white, compact villages and faintly penciled, far and near, with the curving lines of roads and trails. When it is robed in the fresh verdure of spring, it must form a charming picture, even by itself. Skirting its southern border rises Little Hermon, over whose summit a glimpse of Gilboa is caught. Nain, famous for the raising of the widow's son, and Endor, as famous for the performances of her witch, are in view. To the eastward lies the valley of the Jordan, and beyond it the mountains of Gilead. Westward is Mount Carmel. Hermon in the north the tablelands of Bashan Saft, the holy city gleaming white upon a tall spur of the mountains of Lebanon, a steel blue corner of the Sea of Galilee saddle-peaked Hatnin, traditional Mount of Beatitudes, and mute witness to brave fights of the crusading host for Holy Cross. These fill up the picture. To glance at the salient features of this landscape through the picturesque framework of a ragged and ruined stone window arch of the time of Christ, thus hiding from sight all that is unattractive, is to secure to yourself a pleasure worth climbing the mountain to enjoy. One must stand on his head to get the best effect in a fine sunset, and set a landscape in a bold, strong framework that is very close at hand, to bring out all its beauty. One learns this latter truth never more to forget it, in that mimic land of enchantment, the wonderful garden of my lord the Count Pallavicini, near Genoa. You go wandering for hours among hills and wooded glens, artfully contrived to leave the impression that nature shaped them and not man, following winding paths and coming suddenly upon leaping cascades and rustic bridges, finding sylvan lakes where you expected them not, loitering through battered medieval castles in miniature that seem hoary with age and yet were built a dozen years ago, meditating over ancient crumbling tombs, whose marble columns were marred and broken purposely by the modern artists that made them, stumbling unawares upon toy palaces, wrought of rare and costly materials, and again upon a peasant's hut, whose dilapidated furniture would never suggest that it was made so to order, sweeping round and round in the midst of a forest on an enchanted wooden horse that is moved by some invisible agency, traversing Roman roads and passing under majestic triumphal arches, resting in quaint bowers where unseen spirits discharge jets of water on you from every possible direction, and where even the flowers you touch assail you with a shower. Boating on a subterranean lake among caverns and arches royally draped with clustering stalactites, and passing out into open day upon another lake, which is bordered with sloping banks of grass and gay, with patrician barges that swim at anchor in the shadow of a miniature marble temple that rises out of the clear water and glasses its white statues, its rich capitals and fluted columns in the tranquil depths. So, from marvel to marvel, you have drifted on, thinking all the time that the one last scene must be the chiefest. And verily, the chiefest wonder is reserved until the last. But you do not see it until you step ashore, and passing through a wilderness of rare flowers, collected from every corner of the earth, you stand at the door of one more mimic temple. Right in this place, the artist taxed his genius to the utmost and fairly opened the gates of fairyland. You look through an unpretending pane of glass, stained yellow. The first thing you see is a mass of quivering foliage, 10 short steps before you, in the midst of which is a ragged opening like a gateway. A thing that is common enough in nature, and not apt to excite suspicions of a deep human design end above the bottom of the gateway, project in the most careless way. A few broad tropic leaves and brilliant flowers. All of a sudden, through this bright, bold gateway, you catch a glimpse of the faintest, softest, richest picture that ever graced the dream of a dying saint, since John saw the New Jerusalem glimmering above the clouds of heaven. A broad sweep of sea, flecked with careening sails, a sharp, jutting cape and a lofty lighthouse on it, a sloping lawn behind it. Beyond, a portion of the old city of palaces, with its parks and hills and stately mansions. Beyond these, a prodigious mountain with its strong outlines sharply cut against ocean and sky, and over all, vagrant shreds and flakes of cloud, floating in a sea of gold. The ocean is gold, the city is gold, the meadow, the mountain, the sky, everything is golden rich and mellow and dreamy as a vision of paradise. No artist could put upon canvas its entrancing beauty, and yet, without the yellow glass and the carefully contrived accident of a framework that cast it into enchanted distance and shut out from it all unattractive features, it was not a picture to fall into ecstasies over. Such is life, and the trail of the serpent is over us all. There is nothing for it now but to come back to old Tabor, though the subject is tiresome enough, and I cannot stick to it for wandering off to scenes that are pleasanter to remember. I think I will skip anyhow. There is nothing about Tabor, except we concede that it was the scene of the Transfiguration. But some gray old ruins, stacked up there in all ages of the world from the days of stout Gideon and parties that flourished 30 centuries ago to the fresh yesterday of crusading times. It has its Greek convent, and the coffee there is good, but never a splinter of the true cross or bone of a hallowed saint to arrest the idle thoughts of worldlings and turn them into graver channels. A Catholic church is nothing to me that has no relics. The plain of Esdraelon, the battlefield of the nations, only sets one to dreaming of Joshua and Ben-Hadad and Saul and Gideon, Tamerlane Tancred, Coeur de Lion and Saladin, the warrior kings of Persia, Egypt's heroes, and Napoleon, for they all fought here. If the magic of the moonlight could summon from the graves of forgotten centuries and many lands the countless myriads that have battled on this wide, far-reaching floor, and array them in the 1,000 strange costumes of their 100 nationalities, and send the vast host sweeping down the plain, splendid with plumes and banners and glittering lances, I could stay here an age to see the phantom pageant. But the magic of the moonlight is a vanity and a fraud, and whoso putteth his trust in it shall suffer sorrow and disappointment. Down at the foot of Tabor, and just at the edge of the storied plain of Esdraelon, is the insignificant village of Deborah, where Deborah, prophetess of Israel, lived. It is just like Magdala. Chapter 50. We descended from Mount Tabor, crossed a deep ravine, followed a hilly, rocky road to Nazareth, distant 2 hours. All distances in the east are measured by hours, not miles. A good horse will walk 3 miles an hour over nearly any kind of a road. Therefore, an hour here always stands for 3 miles. This method of computation is bothersome and annoying, and until one gets thoroughly accustomed to it, it carries no intelligence to his mind until he has stopped and translated the pagan hours into Christian miles, just as people do with the spoken words of a foreign language they are acquainted with, but not familiarly enough to catch the meaning in a moment. Distances traveled by human feet are also estimated by hours and minutes, though I do not know what the base of the calculation is. In Constantinople you ask, how far is it to the consulate? And they answer, about 10 minutes. How far is it to the Lloyd's agency? Quarter of an hour. How far is it to the lower bridge? 4 minutes. I cannot be positive about it, but I think that there, when a man orders a pair of pantaloons, he says he wants them a quarter of a minute in the legs and 9 seconds around the waist. 2 hours from Tabor to Nazareth, and, as it was an uncommonly narrow, crooked trail, we necessarily met all the camel trains and jackass caravans between Jericho and Jacksonville in that particular place and nowhere else. The donkeys do not matter so much, because they are so small that you can jump your horse over them if he is an animal of spirit, but a camel is not jumpable. A camel is as tall as any ordinary dwelling house in Syria, which is to say a camel is from 1 to 2, and sometimes nearly 3 feet taller than a good-sized man. In this part of the country, his load is oftenest in the shape of colossal sacks, one on each side. He and his cargo take up as much room as a carriage. Think of meeting this style of obstruction in a narrow trail. The camel would not turn out for a king. He stalks serenely along, bringing his cushioned stilts forward with the long, regular swing of a pendulum, and whatever is in the way must get out of the way peaceably or be wiped out forcibly by the bulky sacks. It was a tiresome ride to us and perfectly exhausting to the horses. We were compelled to jump over upwards of 1,800 donkeys, and only one person in the party was unseated less than 60 times by the camels. This seems like a powerful statement, but the poet has said, "Things are not what they seem." I cannot think of anything now more certain to make one shudder than to have a soft-footed camel sneak up behind him and touch him on the ear with its cold, flabby underlip. A camel did this for one of the boys, who was drooping over his saddle in a brown study. He glanced up and saw the majestic apparition hovering above him and made frantic efforts to get out of the way, but the camel reached out and bit him on the shoulder before he accomplished it. This was the only pleasant incident of the journey. At Nazareth, we camped in an olive grove near the Virgin Mary's fountain, and that wonderful Arab guard came to collect some bucksheesh for his services in following us from Tiberias and warding off invisible dangers with the terrors of his armament. The dragoman had paid his master, but that counted as nothing. If you hire a man to sneeze for you here, and another man chooses to help him, you have got to pay both. They do nothing whatever without pay. How it must have surprised these people to hear the way of salvation offered to them, without money and without price. If the manners, the people, or the customs of this country have changed since the Savior's time, the figures and metaphors of the Bible are not the evidences to prove it by. We entered the great Latin convent, which is built over the traditional dwelling place of the Holy Family. We went down a flight of 15 steps below the ground level, and stood in a small chapel tricked out with tapestry hangings, silver lamps, and oil paintings. A spot marked by a cross, in the marble floor under the altar, was exhibited as the place made forever holy by the feet of the Virgin when she stood up to receive the message of the angel. So simple, so unpretending a locality, to be the scene of so mighty an event. The very scene of the Annunciation, an event which has been commemorated by splendid shrines and august temples all over the civilized world, and one which the princes of art have made it their loftiest ambition to picture worthily on their canvas. A spot whose history is familiar to the very children of every house and city and obscure hamlet of the furthest lands of Christendom. A spot which myriads of men would toil across the breadth of a world to see, would consider it a priceless privilege to look upon. It was easy to think these thoughts, but it was not easy to bring myself up to the magnitude of the situation. I could sit off several thousand miles and imagine the angel appearing, with shadowy wings and lustrous countenance, and note the glory that streamed downward upon the Virgin's head, while the message from the throne of God fell upon her ears. One can do that beyond the ocean, but few can do it here. I saw the little recess from which the angel stepped, but could not fill its void. The angels that I know are creatures of unstable fancy. They will not fit in niches of substantial stone. Imagination labors best in distant fields. I doubt if any man can stand in the grotto of the Annunciation, and people with the phantom images of his mind, its 2 tangible walls of stone. They showed us a broken granite pillar, depending from the roof, which they said was hacked in 2 by the Moslem conquerors of Nazareth, in the vain hope of pulling down the sanctuary. But the pillar remained miraculously suspended in the air, and, unsupported itself, supported then and still supports the roof. By dividing this statement up among 8, it was found not difficult to believe it. These gifted Latin monks never do anything by halves. If they were to show you the brazen serpent that was elevated in the wilderness, you could depend upon it that they had on hand the pole it was elevated on also, and even the hole it stood in. They have got the grotto of the Annunciation here, And just as convenient to it as one's throat is to his mouth, they have also the Virgin's kitchen and even her sitting room, where she and Joseph watched the infant Savior play with Hebrew toys 1800 years ago. All under one roof, and all clean, spacious, comfortable grottos. It seems curious that personages intimately connected with the Holy Family always lived in grottos in Nazareth, in Bethlehem, in imperial Ephesus, and yet nobody else in their day and generation thought of doing anything of the kind. If they ever did, their grottos are all gone, and I suppose we ought to wonder at the peculiar marvel of the preservation of these I speak of. When the Virgin fled from Herod's wrath, she hid in a grotto in Bethlehem, and the same is there to this day. The slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem was done in a grotto. The Savior was born in a grotto. Both are shown to pilgrims yet. It is exceedingly strange that these tremendous events all happened in grottos, and exceedingly fortunate. Likewise, because the strongest houses must crumble to ruin in time, but a grotto in the living rock will last forever. It is an imposture, this grotto stuff, but it is one that all men ought to thank the Catholics for. Wherever they ferret out a lost locality made holy by some scriptural event, they straightway build a massive, almost imperishable church there, and preserve the memory of that locality for the gratification of future generations. If it had been left to Protestants to do this most worthy work, we would not even know where Jerusalem is today, and the man who could go and put his finger on Nazareth would be too wise for this world. The world owes the Catholics its goodwill even for the happy rascality of hewing out these bogus grottos in the rock. For it is infinitely more satisfactory to look at a grotto, where people have faithfully believed for centuries that the Virgin once lived, than to have to imagine a dwelling place for her somewhere, anywhere, nowhere, loose and at large all over this town of Nazareth. There is too large a scope of country. The imagination cannot work. There is no one particular spot to chain your eye, rivet your interest, and make you think. The memory of the pilgrims cannot perish while Plymouth Rock remains to us. The old monks are wise. They know how to drive a stake through a pleasant tradition that will hold it to its place forever. We visited the places where Jesus worked for 15 years as a carpenter, and where he attempted to teach in the synagogue and was driven out by a mob. Catholic chapels stand upon these sites and protect the little fragments of the ancient walls which remain. Our pilgrims broke off specimens. We visited, also, a new chapel in the midst of the town, which is built around a boulder some 12 feet long by 4 feet thick. The priests discovered, a few years ago, that the disciples had sat upon this rock to rest once when they had walked up from Capernaum. They hastened to preserve the relic. Relics are very good property. Travelers are expected to pay for seeing them, and they do it cheerfully. We like the idea. One's conscience can never be the worse for the knowledge that he has paid his way like a man. Our pilgrims would have liked very well to get out their lampblack and stencil plates and paint their names on that rock, together with the names of the villages they hail from in America, but the priests permit nothing of that kind. To speak the strict truth, however, our party seldom offend in that way, though we have men in the ship who never lose an opportunity to do it. Our pilgrims' chief sin is their lust for specimens. I suppose that by this time they know the dimensions of that rock to an inch, and its weight to a ton, and I do not hesitate to charge that they will go back there tonight and try to carry it off. This Fountain of the Virgin is the one which tradition says Mary used to get water from 20 times a day, when she was a girl, and bear it away in a jar upon her head. The water streams through faucets in the face of a wall of ancient masonry, which stands removed from the houses of the village. The young girls of Nazareth still collect about it by the dozen and keep up a riotous laughter and skylarking. The Nazarene girls are homely. Some of them have large, lustrous eyes, but none of them have pretty faces. These girls wear a single garment usually, and it is loose, shapeless, of undecided color. It is generally out of repair, too. They wear, from crown to jaw, curious strings of old coins, after the manner of the bells of Tiberias, and brass jewelry upon their wrists and in their ears. They wear no shoes and stockings. They are the most human girls we have found in the country yet, and the best-natured. But there is no question that these picturesque maidens sadly lack comeliness. A pilgrim, the enthusiast said, "See that tall, graceful girl. Look at the Madonna-like beauty of her countenance." Another pilgrim came along presently and said, "Observe that tall, graceful girl. What queenly Madonna-like gracefulness of beauty is in her countenance." I said, "She is not tall, she is short. She is not beautiful, she is homely. She is graceful enough, I grant, but she is rather boisterous." The third and last pilgrim moved by before long, and he said, "Ah, what a tall, graceful girl. What Madonna-like gracefulness of queenly beauty." The verdicts were all in. It was time, now, to look up the authorities for all these opinions. I found this paragraph, which follows. Written by whom? W.M. 100. Grimes. After we were in the saddle, we rode down to the spring to have a last look at the women of Nazareth, who were, as a class, much the prettiest that we had seen in the East. As we approached the crowd, a tall girl of 19 advanced toward Miriam and offered her a cup of water. Her movement was graceful and queenly. We exclaimed on the spot at the Madonna-like beauty of her countenance. Whiteley was suddenly thirsty and begged for water, and drank it slowly with his eyes over the top of the cup, fixed on her large black eyes, which gazed on him quite as curiously as he on her. Then Moray wanted water. She gave it to him, and he managed to spill it so as to ask for another cup, and by the time she came to me, she saw through the operation. Her eyes were full of fun as she looked at me. I laughed outright, and she joined me in as gay a shout as ever country maiden in old Orange County. I wished for a picture of her. A Madonna, whose face was a portrait of that beautiful Nazareth girl, would be a thing of beauty and a joy forever. That is the kind of gruel which has been served out from Palestine for ages. Commend me to Fenimore Cooper to find beauty in the Indians, and to Grimes to find it in the Arabs. Arab men are often fine-looking, but Arab women are not. We can all believe that the Virgin Mary was beautiful. It is not natural to think otherwise, but does it follow that it is our duty to find beauty in these present women of Nazareth? I love to quote from Grimes because he is so dramatic, and because he is so romantic, and because he seems to care but little whether he tells the truth or not, so he scares the reader or excites his envy or his admiration. He went through this peaceful land with one hand forever on his revolver and the other on his pocket handkerchief. Always, when he was not on the point of crying over a holy place, he was on the point of killing an Arab. More surprising things happened to him in Palestine than ever happened to any traveler here or elsewhere since Munchausen died. At Beit Jin, where nobody had interfered with him, he crept out of his tent at dead of night and shot at what he took to be an Arab lying on a rock, some distance away, planning evil. The Baal killed a wolf. Just before he fired, he makes a dramatic picture of himself as usual, to scare the reader. Was it imagination, or did I see a moving object on the surface of the rock? If it were a man, why did he not now drop me? He had a beautiful shot, as I stood out in my black bournous against the white tent. I had the sensation of an entering bullet in my throat, breast, brain. Reckless creature. Riding toward Gennesaret, they saw two Bedouins, and we looked to our pistols and loosened them quietly in our shawls, etc. Always cool. In Samaria, he charged up a hill in the face of a volley of stones. He fired into the crowd of men who threw them. He says, "I never lost an opportunity of impressing the Arabs with the perfection of American and English weapons, and the danger of attacking any one of the armed Franks. I think the lesson of that ball not lost." At Beit Jin, he gave his whole band of Arab muleteers a piece of his mind, and then I contented myself with a solemn assurance that if there occurred another instance of disobedience to orders, I would thrash the responsible party as he never dreamed of being thrashed. And if I could not find who was responsible, I would whip them all from first to last, whether there was a governor at hand to do it or I had to do it myself. Perfectly fearless, this man. He rode down the perpendicular path in the rocks, from the castle of Banias to the oak grove, at a flying gallop, his horse striding 30 feet at every bound. I stand prepared to bring 30 reliable witnesses to prove that Putnam's famous feat at Horseneck was insignificant compared to this. Behold him always theatrical looking at Jerusalem this time, by an oversight, with his hand off his pistol for once. I stood in the road, my hand on my horse's neck, and with my dim eyes sought to trace the outlines of the holy places which I had long before fixed in my mind, but the fast-flowing tears forbade my succeeding. There were our Mohammedan servants, a Latin monk, 2 Armenians and a Jew in our cortege, and all alike gazed with overflowing eyes. If Latin monks and Arabs cried, I know to a moral certainty that the horses cried also, and so the picture is complete. But when necessity demanded, he could be firm as adamant. In the Lebanon Valley, an Arab youth a Christian. He is particular to explain that Mohammedans do not robbed him of a paltry $10 worth of powder and shot. He convicted him before a sheik and looked on while he was punished by the terrible bastinado. Hear him. Mousa was on his back in a twinkling, howling, shouting, screaming, but he was carried out to the piazza before the door, where we could see the operation, and laid face down. One man sat on his back and one on his legs, the latter holding up his feet, while a third laid on the bare soles a rhinoceros hide courbesh. A courbesh is Arabic for cowhide, the cow being a rhinoceros. It is the most cruel whip known to fame. Heavy as lead and flexible as India rubber, usually about 40 inches long and tapering gradually from an inch in diameter to a point, it administers a blow which leaves its mark for time. Scow Life in Egypt, by the same author, that whizzed through the air at every stroke. Poor Morate was in agony, and Nama II, mother and sister of Mousa, were on their faces begging and wailing, now embracing my knees and now Whiteley's, while the brother outside made the air ring with cries louder than Mouse's. Even Yusef came and asked me on his knees to relent. And last of all, Batuni the rascal had lost a feed bag in their house, and had been loudest in his denunciations that morning besought the Hawaji to have mercy on the fellow. But not he. The punishment was suspended, at the 15th blow, to hear the confession. Then Grimes and his party rode away, and left the entire Christian family to be fined, and as severely punished as the Mohammedan sheik should deem proper. As I mounted, Yusef once more begged me to interfere and have mercy on them, but I looked around at the dark faces of the crowd, and I couldn't find one drop of pity in my heart for them. He closes his picture with a rollicking burst of humor, which contrasts finely with the grief of the mother and her children. One more paragraph. Then once more I bowed my head. It is no shame to have wept in Palestine. I wept when I saw Jerusalem. I wept when I lay in the starlight at Bethlehem. I wept on the blessed shores of Galilee. My hand was no less firm on the rein. My anger did not tremble on the trigger of my pistol when I rode with it in my right hand along the shore of the blue sea, weeping. My eye was not dimmed by those tears, nor my heart in aught weakened. Let him who would sneer at my emotion close this volume here, for he will find little to his taste in my journeyings through Holy Land. He never bored, but he struck water. I am aware that this is a pretty voluminous notice of Mr. Grimes' book. However, it is proper and legitimate to speak of it, for Nomadic Life in Palestine is a representative book, the representative of a class of Palestine books, and a criticism upon it will serve for a criticism upon them all. And since I am treating it in the comprehensive capacity of a representative book, I have taken the liberty of giving to both book and author fictitious names. Perhaps it is in better taste, anyhow, to do this. Chapter 51. Nazareth is wonderfully interesting because the town has an air about it of being precisely as Jesus left it, and one finds himself saying, all the time, the boy Jesus has stood in this doorway, has played in that street, has touched these stones with his hands, has rambled over these chalky hills. Whoever shall write the boyhood of Jesus ingeniously will make a book which will possess a vivid interest for young and old alike. I judge so from the greater interest we found in Nazareth than any of our speculations upon Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee gave rise to. It was not possible, standing by the Sea of Galilee, to frame more than a vague, faraway idea of the majestic personage who walked upon the crested waves as if they had been solid earth, and who touched the dead and they rose up and spoke. I read among my notes, now, with a new interest, some sentences from an edition of 1621 of the apocryphal New Testament. Christ, kissed by a bride made dumb by sorcerers, cures her. a leprous girl cured by the water in which the infant Christ was washed, and becomes the servant of Joseph and Mary. The leprous son of a prince cured in like manner. A young man who had been bewitched and turned into a mule, miraculously cured by the infant Savior being put on his back, and is married to the girl who had been cured of leprosy. Whereupon the bystanders praise God. Chapter 16. Christ miraculously widens or contracts gates, milk pails, sieves, or boxes not properly made by Joseph, he not being skillful at his carpenter's trade. The king of Jerusalem gives Joseph an order for a throne. Joseph works on it for 2 years and makes it 2 spans too short. The king being angry with him, Jesus comforts him, commands him to pull one side of the throne while he pulls the other, and brings it to its proper dimensions. Chapter 19. Jesus, charged with throwing a boy from the roof of a house, miraculously causes the dead boy to speak and acquit him, fetches water for his mother, breaks the pitcher, and miraculously gathers the water in his mantle and brings it home. Sent to a schoolmaster, refuses to tell his letters, and the schoolmaster going to whip him, his hand withers. Further on in this quaint volume of rejected Gospels is an epistle of Saint Clement to the Corinthians, which was used in the churches and considered genuine 14 or 1500 years ago. In it, this account of the fabled phoenix occurs. 1. Let us consider that wonderful type of the resurrection, which is seen in the eastern countries, that is to say, in Arabia. 2. There is a certain bird called a phoenix. Of this there is never but one at a time, and that lives 500 years. And when the time of its dissolution draws near, that it must die, it makes itself a nest of frankincense, and myrrh, and other spices, into which, when its time is fulfilled, it enters and dies. 3. But its flesh, putrefying, breeds a certain worm, which, being nourished by the juice of the dead bird, brings forth feathers. And when it is grown to a perfect state, it takes up the nest in which the bones of its parent lie, and carries it from Arabia into Egypt to a city called Heliopolis. 4. And flying in open day in the sight of all men, lays it upon the altar of the sun, and so returns from whence it came. 5. The priests then search into the records of the time, and find that it returned precisely at the end of 500 years. Business is business, and there is nothing like punctuality, especially in a phoenix. The few chapters relating to the infancy of the Savior contain many things which seem frivolous and not worth preserving. A large part of the remaining portions of the book read like good scripture, however. There is one verse that ought not to have been rejected, because it so evidently prophetically refers to the general run of Congresses of the United States. 199. They carry themselves high and as prudent men, and though they are fools, yet would seem to be teachers. I have set these extracts down as I found them. Everywhere among the cathedrals of France and Italy, one finds traditions of personages that do not figure in the Bible, and of miracles that are not mentioned in its pages. But they are all in this apocryphal New Testament, and though they have been ruled out of our modern Bible, it is claimed that they were accepted gospel 12 or 15 centuries ago and ranked as high in credit as any. One needs to read this book before he visits those venerable cathedrals, with their treasures of tabooed and forgotten tradition. They imposed another pirate upon us, at Nazareth another invincible Arab guard. We took our last look at the city, clinging like a whitewashed wasp's nest to the hillside, and at 8 o'clock in the morning departed. We dismounted and drove the horses down a bridle path which I think was fully as crooked as a corkscrew, which I know to be as steep as the downward sweep of a rainbow, and which I believe to be the worst piece of road in the geography, except one in the Sandwich Islands, which I remember painfully, and possibly 1 or 2 mountain trails in the Sierra Nevadas. Often, in this narrow path, the horse had to poise himself nicely on a rude stone step, and then drop his 4 feet over the edge and down, something more than half his own height. This brought his nose near the ground, while his tail pointed up toward the sky somewhere, and gave him the appearance of preparing to stand on his head. A horse cannot look dignified in this position. We accomplished the long descent at last, and trotted across the great plain of Esdraelon. Some of us will be shot before we finish this pilgrimage. The pilgrims read nomadic life, and keep themselves in a constant state of quixotic heroism. They have their hands on their pistols all the time, and every now and then, when you least expect it, they snatch them out and take aim at Bedouins who are not visible, and draw their knives and make savage passes at other Bedouins who do not exist. I am in deadly peril always, for these spasms are sudden and irregular, and of course I cannot tell when to be getting out of the way. If I am accidentally murdered, sometime, during one of these romantic frenzies of the pilgrims, Mr. Grimes must be rigidly held to answer as an accessory before the fact. If the pilgrims would take deliberate aim and shoot at a man, it would be all right and proper because that man would not be in any danger. But these random assaults are what I object to. I do not wish to see any more places like Esdraelon, where the ground is level and people can gallop. It puts melodramatic nonsense into the pilgrims' heads. All at once, when one is jogging along stupidly in the sun and thinking about something ever so far away, here they come, at a stormy gallop, spurring and whooping at those ridgy old sore-backed plugs till their heels fly higher than their heads. And as they whiz by, out comes a little potato gun of a revolver, there is a startling little pop, and a small pellet goes singing through the air. Now that I have begun this pilgrimage, I intend to go through with it, though sooth to say, nothing but the most desperate valor has kept me to my purpose up to the present time. I do not mind Bedouins, I am not afraid of them, because neither Bedouins nor ordinary Arabs have shown any disposition to harm us, but I do feel afraid of my own comrades. Arriving at the furthest verge of the plain, we rode a little way up a hill and found ourselves at Endor, famous for its witch. Her descendants are there yet. They were the wildest horde of half-naked savages we have found thus far. They swarmed out of mud hives, out of hovels of the dry goods box pattern, out of gaping caves under shelving rocks, out of crevices in the earth. In 5 minutes the dead solitude and silence of the place were no more, and a begging, screeching, shouting mob were struggling about the horses' feet and blocking the way. Bakshish! 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 Hawaji bakshish! It was Magdala over again, only here the glare from the infidel eyes was fierce and full of hate. The population numbers 250, and more than half the citizens live in caves in the rock. Dirt, degradation, and savagery are Endor's specialty. We say no more about Magdala and debris now. Endor heads the list. It is worse than any Indian Campuri. The hill is barren, rocky, and forbidding. No sprig of grass is visible, and only one tree. This is a fig tree, which maintains a precarious footing among the rocks at the mouth of the dismal cavern, once occupied by the veritable witch of Endor. In this cavern, tradition says, Saul, the king, sat at midnight and stared and trembled while the earth shook. The thunders crashed among the hills, and out of the midst of fire and smoke the spirit of the dead prophet rose up and confronted him. Saul had crept to this place in the darkness, while his army slept, to learn what fate awaited him in the morrow's battle. He went away a sad man, to meet disgrace and death. A spring trickles out of the rock in the gloomy recesses of the cavern, and we were thirsty. The citizens of Endor objected to our going in there. They do not mind dirt. They do not mind rags. They do not mind vermin. They do not mind barbarous ignorance and savagery. They do not mind a reasonable degree of starvation, but they do like to be pure and holy before their God, whoever he may be, and therefore they shudder and grow almost pale at the idea of Christian lips polluting a spring whose waters must descend into their sanctified gullets. We had no wanton desire to wound even their feelings or trample upon their prejudices, but we were out of water, thus early in the day, and were burning up with thirst. It was at this time, and under these circumstances, that I framed an aphorism which has already become celebrated. I said necessity knows no law. We went in and drank. We got away from the noisy wretches, finally, dropping them in squads and couples as we filed over the hills, the aged first, the infants next, the young girls further on. The strong men ran beside us a mile, and only left when they had secured the last possible piaster in the way of bucksheesh. In an hour we reached Nain, where Christ raised the widow's son to life. Nain is Magdala on a small scale. It has no population of any consequence. Within 100 yards of it is the original graveyard, for aught I know. The tombstones lie flat on the ground, which is Jewish fashion in Syria. I believe the Muslims do not allow them to have upright tombstones. A Moslem grave is usually roughly plastered over and whitewashed, and has at one end an upright projection, which is shaped into exceedingly rude attempts at ornamentation. In the cities, there is often no appearance of a grave at all. A tall, slender marble tombstone, elaborately leaded, gilded, and painted, marks the burial place, and this is surmounted by a turban, so carved and shaped as to signify the dead man's rank in life. They showed a fragment of ancient wall which they said was one side of the gate out of which the widow's dead son was being brought so many centuries ago, when Jesus met the procession. Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up, and began to speak. And he delivered him to his mother. And there came a fear on all. And they glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. A little mosque stands upon the spot, which tradition says was occupied by the widow's dwelling. 2 or 3 aged Arabs sat about its door. We entered, and the pilgrims broke specimens from the foundation walls, though they had to touch, and even step, upon the praying carpets to do it. It was almost the same as breaking pieces from the hearts of those old Arabs. To step rudely upon the sacred praying mats, with booted feet, a thing not done by any Arab, was to inflict pain upon men who had not offended us in any way. Suppose a party of armed foreigners were to enter a village church in America and break ornaments from the altar railings for curiosities, and climb up and walk upon the Bible and the pulpit cushions. However, the cases are different. One is the profanation of a temple of our faith, the other, only the profanation of a pagan one. We descended to the plain again, and halted a moment at a well of Abraham's time, no doubt. It was in a desert place. It was walled 3 feet above ground with squared and heavy blocks of stone, after the manner of Bible pictures. Around it some camels stood, and others knelt. There was a group of sober little donkeys, with naked, dusky children clambering about them, or sitting astride their rumps, or pulling their tails. Tawny, black-eyed, barefooted maids, arrayed in rags and adorned with brazen armlets and pinchbeck earrings, were poising water jars upon their heads, or drawing water from the well. A flock of sheep stood by, waiting for the shepherds to fill the hollowed stones with water, so that they might drink stones which, like those that walled the well, were worn smooth and deeply creased by the chafing chins of 100 generations of thirsty animals. Picturesque Arabs sat upon the ground, in groups, and solemnly smoked their long-stemmed chabouks. Other Arabs were filling black hogskins with water skins which, well filled, and distended with water till the short legs projected painfully out of the proper line, looked like the corpses of hogs bloated by drowning. Here was a grand oriental picture, which I had worshipped 1,000 times in soft, rich steel engravings. But in the engraving there was no desolation, no dirt, no rags, no fleas, no ugly features, no sore eyes, no feasting flies, no besotted ignorance in the countenances, no raw places on the donkeys' backs, no disagreeable jabbering in unknown tongues, no stench of camels. No suggestion that a couple of tons of powder placed under the party and touched off would heighten the effect and give to the scene a genuine interest and a charm which it would always be pleasant to recall, even though a man lived 1,000 years. Oriental scenes look best in steel engravings. I cannot be imposed upon any more by that picture of the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon. I shall say to myself, You look fine, madam, but your feet are not clean and you smell like a camel. Presently a wild Arab in charge of a camel train recognized an old friend in Ferguson, and they ran and fell upon each other's necks and kissed each other's grimy, bearded faces upon both cheeks. It explained instantly a something which had always seemed to me only a far-fetched oriental figure of speech. I refer to the circumstance of Christ's rebuking a Pharisee or some such character, and reminding him that from him he had received no kiss of welcome. It did not seem reasonable to me that men should kiss each other, but I am aware now that they did. There was reason in it too. The custom was natural and proper, because people must kiss, and a man would not be likely to kiss one of the women of this country of his own free will and accord. One must travel to learn. Every day, now, old scriptural phrases that never possessed any significance for me before take to themselves a meaning. We journeyed around the base of the mountain Little Hermon, past the old Crusaders' castle of El Fiole, and arrived at Shunem. This was another Magdala, to a fraction, frescoes and all. Here, tradition says, the prophet Samuel was born, and here the Shunammite woman built a little house upon the city wall for the accommodation of the prophet Elisha. Elisha asked her what she expected in return. It was a perfectly natural question, for these people are and were in the habit of proffering favors and services and then expecting and begging for pay. Elisha knew them well. He could not comprehend that anybody should build for him that humble little chamber for the mere sake of old friendship, and with no selfish motive whatever. It used to seem a very impolite, not to say a rude, question for Elisha to ask the woman, but it does not seem so to me now. The woman said she expected nothing. Then for her goodness and her unselfishness, he rejoiced her heart with the news that she should bear a son. It was a high reward, but she would not have thanked him, for daughters have always been unpopular here. The son was born, grew, waxed strong, died. Elisha restored him to life in Shunem. We found here a grove of lemon trees cool, shady, hung with fruit. One is apt to overestimate beauty when it is rare, but to me, this grove seemed very beautiful. It was beautiful. I do not overestimate it. I must always remember Shunem gratefully, as a place which gave to us this leafy shelter after our long, hot ride. We lunched, rested, chatted, smoked our pipes an hour, and then mounted and moved on. As we trotted across the plain of Jezreel, we met half a dozen Digger Indians, Bedouins, with very long spears in their hands, cavorting around on old crowbait horses and spearing imaginary enemies, whooping and fluttering their rags in the wind, and carrying on in every respect like a pack of hopeless lunatics. At last, here were the wild, free sons of the desert, speeding over the plain like the wind on their beautiful Arabian mares. We had read so much about and longed so much to see. Here were the picturesque costumes. This was the gallant spectacle: tatterdemalion vagrant sheep braggadocio, Arabian mares, spined and necked like the ichthyosaurus in the museum, and humped and cornered like a dromedary. To glance at the genuine son of the desert is to take the romance out of him forever. To behold his steed is to long in charity to strip his harness off and let him fall to pieces. Presently we came to a ruinous old town on a hill, the same being the ancient Jezreel. Ahab, king of Samaria, this was a very vast kingdom for those days, and was very nearly half as large as Rhode Island, dwelt in the city of Jezreel, which was his capital. Near him lived a man by the name of Naboth, who had a vineyard. The king asked him for it, and when he would not give it, offered to buy it. But Naboth refused to sell it. In those days it was considered a sort of crime to part with one's inheritance at any price, and even if a man did part with it, it reverted to himself or his heirs again at the next Jubilee year. So this spoiled child of a king went and lay down on the bed with his face to the wall, and grieved sorely. The queen, a notorious character in those days, and whose name is a byword and a reproach even in these, came in and asked him wherefore he sorrowed, and he told her. Jezebel said she could secure the vineyard, and she went forth and forged letters to the nobles and wise men in the king's name, and ordered them to proclaim a fast and set Naboth on high before the people, and suborned 2 witnesses to swear that he had blasphemed. They did it, and the people stoned the accused by the city wall, and he died. Then Jezebel came and told the king, and said, Behold, Naboth is no more, rise up and seize the vineyard. So Ahab seized the vineyard, and went into it to possess it. But the prophet Elijah came to him there, and read his fate to him, and the fate of Jezebel, and said that in the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, dogs should also lick his blood, and he said, likewise, the dogs should eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. In the course of time, the king was killed in battle, And when his chariot wheels were washed in the pool of Samaria, the dogs licked the blood. In after years, Jehu, who was king of Israel, marched down against Jezreel by order of one of the prophets, and administered one of those convincing rebukes so common among the people of those days. He killed many kings and their subjects, and as he came along he saw Jezebel, painted and finely dressed, looking out of a window, and ordered that she be thrown down to him. A servant did it, and Jehu's horse trampled her underfoot. Then Jehu went in and sat down to dinner, and presently he said, "Go and bury this cursed woman, for she is a king's daughter." The spirit of charity came upon him too late, however, for the prophecy had already been fulfilled. The dogs had eaten her, and they found no more of her than the skull, and the feet, and the palms of her hands. Ahab, the late king, had left a helpless family behind him, and Jehu killed 70 of the orphan sons. Then he killed all the relatives, and teachers, and servants, and friends of the family, and rested from his labors, until he was come near to Samaria, where he met 42 persons and asked them who they were. They said they were brothers of the king of Judah. He killed them. When he got to Samaria, he said he would show his zeal for the Lord. So he gathered all the priests and people together that worshipped Baal, pretending that he was going to adopt that worship and offer up a great sacrifice. And when they were all shut up where they could not defend themselves, he caused every person of them to be killed. Then Jehu, the good missionary, rested from his labors once more. We went back to the valley and rode to the fountain of Ain Gelad. They call it the fountain of Jezreel, usually. It is a pond about 100 feet square and 4 feet deep, with a stream of water trickling into it from under an overhanging ledge of rocks. It is in the midst of a great solitude. Here Gideon pitched his camp in the old times. Behind Shunem lay the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the children of the east, who were as grasshoppers for multitude. Both they and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seaside for multitude. Which means that there were 135,000 men, and that they had transportation service accordingly. Gideon, with only 300 men, surprised them in the night, and stood by and looked on while they butchered each other until 120,000 lay dead on the field. We camped at Jenin before night, and got up and started again at 1 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere towards daylight we passed the locality where the best authenticated tradition locates the pit into which Joseph's brethren threw him. And about noon, after passing over a succession of mountain tops, clad with groves of fig and olive trees, with the Mediterranean in sight some 40 miles away, and going by many ancient biblical cities whose inhabitants glowered savagely upon our Christian procession, and were seemingly inclined to practice on it with stones, we came to the singularly terraced and unlovely hills that betrayed that we were out of Galilee and into Samaria at last. We climbed a high hill to visit the city of Samaria, where the woman may have hailed from who conversed with Christ at Jacob's well, and from whence, no doubt, came also the celebrated Good Samaritan. Herod the Great is said to have made a magnificent city of this place, and a great number of coarse limestone columns, 20 feet high and 2 feet through, that are almost guiltless of architectural grace of shape and ornament, are pointed out by many authors as evidence of the fact. They would not have been considered handsome in ancient Greece, however. The inhabitants of this camp are particularly vicious, and stoned 2 parties of our pilgrims a day or 2 ago, who brought about the difficulty by showing their revolvers when they did not intend to use them, a thing which is deemed bad judgment in the far west, and ought certainly to be so considered anywhere. In the new territories, when a man puts his hand on a weapon, he knows that he must use it. He must use it instantly or expect to be shot down where he stands. Those pilgrims had been reading Grimes. There was nothing for us to do in Samaria but buy handfuls of old Roman coins at a franc a dozen, and look at a dilapidated church of the Crusaders and a vault in it, which once contained the body of John the Baptist. This relic was long ago carried away to Genoa. Samaria stood a disastrous siege, once in the days of Elisha, at the hands of the king of Syria. Provisions reached such a figure that an ass head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the 4th part of a cab of doves dung for 5 pieces of silver. An incident recorded of that heavy time will give one a very good idea of the distress that prevailed within these crumbling walls. As the king was walking upon the battlements one day, a woman cried out, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And the king said, "What aileth thee?" And she answered, "This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him. And I said unto her on the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him, and she hath hid her son." The prophet Elisha declared that within 24 hours the prices of food should go down to nothing, almost, and it was so. The Syrian army broke camp and fled. For some cause or other, the famine was relieved from without, and many a shoddy speculator in dove's dung and ass's meat was ruined. We were glad to leave this hot and dusty old village and hurry on. At 2 o'clock we stopped to lunch and rest at ancient Shechem, between the historic mounts of Gerizim and Ebal, where in the old times the books of the law, the curses and the blessings, were read from the heights to the Jewish multitudes below.